On May 9th, 2015, 46-year-old Marty Durham was sitting on his bed in Sand Lake, Michigan, and he couldn't stop laughing. Because his pet African gray parrot, named Bud, was perched in his cage near the bed, and the bird was just swearing and cussing up a storm. And Marty thought it was hysterical. African gray parrots are considered to be some of the very best mimics. They can imitate specific voices, and they can also have vocabularies of close to 1,000 words. And Bud's vocabulary clearly included more than a few swear words. As his parrot continued to cuss away, Marty began to hear voices coming from the living room. So he told Bud he'd see him later. Then Marty placed his hands firmly on the bed, and he slowly pushed himself up to his feet. Immediately, Marty felt a twinge of pain shoot through his legs, but he shook it off. About 20 years earlier, Marty had been in this terrible car accident, and he'd suffered very serious injuries. Marty had eventually recovered, but he'd had to battle pain in his legs and back ever since. And that pain had actually only gotten worse over time as Marty got older, and so now Marty had to actually wear a brace on one of his legs just to help him walk. Marty made his way from the bedroom down a hallway towards the living room. Marty was tall with short brown hair and a mustache, and he was wearing a t-shirt and denim shorts. Marty stepped into the living room, and he saw his wife Glenna was speaking with his adult son who had stopped by to visit. Marty had 3 children from a previous marriage, and all of them were grown up and out of the house. But they still came by fairly often to spend time with their dad and their stepmom. Marty gave his son a hug, and then he sat down on the couch next to Glenna. The living room was almost like a shrine to Marty's favorite pastime, which was hunting. There were buckheads mounted on the wall as trophies, and the brown leather couch was draped with all these blankets that had images of deer on them. Marty's son asked how Bud the parrot was doing, and Marty just started laughing again, and then he told his son about how Bud was just ranting in the bedroom. Marty and his ex-wife, Christina, had had Bud since the kids were young, so Marty's son had grown up with this bird. After chatting for a bit, Marty asked his son and his wife if they wanted to go outside, and they said yes. So Glenna stood up and she helped Marty get to his feet. Glenna, like Marty, was 46 years old, and she had long brown hair and she wore glasses. Glenna unlocked the back door, and then the 3 of them stepped out onto the new wooden deck that Marty and Glenna had just put in. It was an absolutely perfect day, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Marty breathed in the fresh air, and he felt an utter sense of calm come over him. Being outside was like freedom to Marty. There was just nothing like it as far as he was concerned. And that was actually a huge reason why he'd bought the house where he and Glenna now lived. Years after Marty's terrible car accident, he had received some insurance money from the crash, and he had used that money to help him buy his blue wooden house in a very secluded area in the small rural town of Sand Lake. Marty loved the house itself, but it was actually the land that the house sat on that made him happier than almost anything else. From the deck, Marty looked out across the huge backyard at all the surrounding woods, and he couldn't help but think about his next hunting trip. If it were up to him, he'd go hunting or fishing every single day. But he knew he had to take it easy sometimes to give his legs a rest. Marty, Glenna, and Marty's son spent a good part of the day just sitting outside on the deck and talking. And then at some point, Marty's son said he needed to get home, so Marty stood up and he gave his son another hug, and then told him he'd see him soon. Then Marty's son said bye and left the deck and walked around the house towards the front where his car was, and Marty and Glenna just stayed out back on the deck. And hours later, Marty and Glenna were still outside, and they watched the sky turn gold and red as the sun began to set. Marty knew there was no such thing as a perfect life, and he had been through enough to know that everything could change in an instant. But there were times, like right now, when he just couldn't imagine being in a better place than he was. He had 3 kids that he loved dearly, and he was a grandfather with another grandchild on the way. He had this amazing house on this great land, and he was married to someone who he genuinely loved, Glenna. Marty and Glenna had actually first met when they were teenagers, and they had been attracted to each other right away. They began dating, and for a while, they spent as much time together as they could. Both Marty and Glenna had a shared love of nature, so they were always out and about walking around in the forest and going on long walks together, and they also spent a lot of time together hanging out with friends in town. But then, to the shock of a lot of their friends, Marty and Glenna had broken up and gone their separate ways. And not long after they had broken up, they both got married to other people. Marty married Christina, his first wife, and they had 3 kids together and their pet parrot Bud, and for years they had a pretty happy life together. And Glenna had gotten married and had kids of her own too. After Marty's car accident, Christina, his first wife, helped him a lot during his recovery. But their relationship started to become strained over time, and they ended up getting divorced about 5 years after Marty's wreck. Then Marty had moved out, bought the blue wooden house on the amazing land, and continued to raise his kids. It turned out that Glenna had also gotten a divorce, and Marty and Glenna, who had almost been inseparable as teenagers, ultimately reconnected and rekindled their relationship. Glenna had moved back in with Marty back in 2001, and a few years later, they had gotten married. Some of their friends thought it seemed like no time had passed at all, like somehow Marty and Glenna were the exact same together as they had been when they were kids. They could still just sit down and talk for hours at a time and not get bored, and they still love spending loads of time outdoors together. On the backyard deck, Marty and Glenna watched the last rays of sun disappear and then went inside the house. Glenna went to the kitchen to get dinner ready, and Marty headed to the bedroom. On the way to the bedroom, he checked the front door to make sure it was locked. Marty had always been someone who was very cautious, and so he liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted even when he and Glenna were home during the day. Some of that precaution was really just because that was Marty's nature, but it was also because Marty knew he kept several hunting weapons and handguns in the house, so if someone did come into the home, he knew things could turn violent very quickly. And even though they did live in a pretty secluded area, there was a road not too far from them, so people did pass by them, and Marty just didn't want to take any chances. Marty walked into his bedroom, and he saw Bud the parrot bobbing back and forth on his perch. Then Marty stepped into the bathroom, and he took a prescription pain pill out of a bottle on the counter, and he washed the pill down with water from the sink. Marty took a deep breath, went back into the bedroom, and sat down on the bed. Marty didn't usually take as many pain pills as were prescribed to him for a day, but sometimes in the evening, his leg pain got a lot worse, and the pills really helped. But even with the big inconvenience of chronic pain, and some of the other issues his car accident had caused over the years, Marty still tried hard not to dwell on the past. And as he sat there waiting for his pain meds to kick in, he smiled because he was thankful for what he had. A great family, a house he loved, and a foul-mouthed talking bird who could always make him laugh. On the evening of May 11th, 2015, so 2 days after Marty's son had come to visit, the smell of Italian food wafted through Marty and Glenna's house. Marty walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Then Glenna came over and put down a plate of spaghetti and garlic bread in front of him, and then she also put another plate down for herself, and she sat down across from Marty. As they ate dinner, Marty talked about wanting to plan a trip with some friends to go hunting wild boar and ram. Those types of hunting trips were far more complicated to coordinate than deer hunting trips in this area. And the pain in Marty's legs often made it very difficult for him to drive, which might make the trip even more complicated. Still, Marty was excited to try to put the trip together, and Glenna didn't have any objections. She often drove Marty to his doctor's appointments or other important places he had to go, and so they could figure something out for the hunting trip if they needed to. After dinner, Glenna picked up the plates and left them on the counter in the kitchen. Then Marty and Glenna went to the living room and watched TV for a couple of hours. Finally, just after midnight, Marty was tired, so he said goodnight to Glenna, he got up, and he went to their bedroom. Glenna told him she was going to stay up a bit longer and look at her phone. Once he was in the bedroom, Marty undressed and got into bed. He then said goodnight to Bud the parrot, then flipped off the light and went to sleep. But hours later, at about 5 a.m., Marty suddenly woke up feeling really startled. He heard his closet door open, and then he heard shouting. And then Bud the parrot began squawking from his perch, and Marty was just so confused he had no idea what was going on. But then Marty's eyes focused in the low light, and he saw there was someone standing in his bedroom just a few feet away. And so Marty shouted at this person in the room, and the bird squawked even louder. Over 24 hours later, so on May 13th, Marty and Glenna's neighbor watched smoke rising into the air not far from her house. Then the neighbor heard the screams of sirens and saw a fire truck barreling down her road. The neighbor was very worried about Marty and Glenna. She had texted both of them several times the day before, but neither of them had responded, and this just was not like them. The neighbor and Marty and Glenna were all very good friends, and they talked and texted all the time, and they were always very quick to get back to each other. The neighbor had also gone by Marty and Glenna's house the day before, but the couple hadn't been home. And so now that this neighbor is seeing fire trucks come bombing down her road and she's seeing smoke in the air, naturally she worried that the fire might be coming from Marty and Glenna's house. And so the neighbor just ran outside and began running down the street towards Marty and Glenna's house. And as she ran down the road, she saw the fire trucks up ahead coming to a stop and the firefighters jumping down off the truck to get the hoses ready to put out the fire. But as the neighbor went down the road, she realized that it was actually a small fire that was not on Marty and Glenna's property. Their house was not on fire. And so the neighbor was totally relieved, but since the neighbor was already outside, they decided they would just go to Marty and Glenna's house to see if maybe they were home now. But when the neighbor crossed Marty and Glenna's huge front yard and arrived on their front porch and knocked on the door, there was no answer. The neighbor thought about leaving, but she just couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong with Marty and Glenna. So the neighbor just reached down and grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it, and shockingly, the doorknob turned because the door was unlocked. And this really frightened the neighbor. She knew how much Marty liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted basically all the time. The neighbor cautiously opened up the door and then stepped inside the house, and then began calling out to Marty and Glenna. But the house was silent. So the neighbor turned the corner and walked into the living room, and when she did, it was like her heart skipped a beat, because the place was a total wreck. A lamp had been tipped over and knocked off a table, and there were papers and trash scattered all across the floor. Then the neighbor heard the parrot, Bud, begin to squawk in Marty and Glenna's bedroom. So the neighbor walked down the hallway to the bedroom, and they stepped inside, and Bud, who was in the back cage, squawked louder and louder, and the neighbor just kind of looked around the bedroom, and at first it just looked like a normal bedroom, except for the fact that all the blankets from the bed were basically piled on the ground right in front of the door. So the neighbor stepped over those blankets and began walking towards the back of the bedroom to see what was next to the bed, and when she saw what was on the ground next to the bed, the neighbor just froze. Because there, next to the bed on the ground, was Marty, in his underwear, with his face and chest covered in blood. The neighbor was totally shocked, and they turned to run out of the room, but as soon as she turned, she looked down and realized now from her vantage point, she could see that actually Glenna was inside of those blankets that she had stepped over when she first came in. And now the neighbor was seeing Glenna's face, and Glenna's skin was pale and her hair was matted down with blood. And the neighbor just screamed and jumped over Glenna and ran out of that house and then screamed for all the firefighters who were right nearby putting out that small fire. And one of the firefighters saw the neighbor and rushed over to her, and after she explained what she just found in her friend's house, the firefighter motioned for two of the first responders, and then the three of them ran into Marty and Glenna's house. And then as soon as they walked into the bedroom and actually saw Marty and Glenna on the ground, the first responders knew they were dealing with a crime scene. And so one of the firefighters called police dispatch, and he said they had just found two dead bodies and they needed police on the scene ASAP. About 2 hours later, at around 5:30 p.m., Sergeant Gary Wilson of the Michigan State Police arrived in front of Marty and Glenna's house. Sergeant Wilson saw an ambulance and a fire truck nearby, and there were multiple firefighters, paramedics, and state troopers standing outside the house. Sergeant Wilson got out of his car and walked over to one of the firefighters. The firefighter explained that they had to put out a small fire in the area, but then this woman had come running out of Marty and Glenna's house screaming for help. The firefighter said, once they had seen what was inside of the house, members of the fire department and other first responders were instructed to stay outside until police arrived, because it was believed the house was now a crime scene. Now, Sergeant Wilson had been told all of this already by police dispatch. He also had been told that he was very likely responding to a double suicide. But when Wilson approached the house, one of the state troopers went over to meet him, and that trooper believed there was a strong chance they were actually dealing with a double homicide, not double suicide. Wilson followed the trooper inside the house to the bedroom. And when Wilson saw Marty on the floor, he was also pretty sure the man had not killed himself. Marty had multiple gunshot wounds, and there was no weapon nearby. Then Wilson stepped over to the pile of blankets on the floor to get a better look at Glenna's body, but when he crouched down on one knee and leaned in closer to her, he heard a loud gasp. Glenna's eyes opened, and then she screamed. Wilson stood and stumbled back a few steps. He was in shock. but he quickly called for a paramedic and kept shouting over and over again that she's alive, guys, get in here. Paramedics rushed into the bedroom and began working to get Glenna oxygen. Then they put her on a stretcher, wheeled her outside, and got her into the ambulance. As the ambulance sped away to the hospital, Wilson stood in Glenna and Marty's bedroom, trying to recover from the shock of what had just happened. And then once he'd caught his breath and calmed down, Sergeant Wilson called in that one of the victims, who everybody thought was dead, was actually alive. And also, Wilson said he believed they were not dealing with a suicide, but a murder, and so he needed a forensics team. Not long after Glenna woke up in the bedroom, a state forensics team arrived at the property and began doing a thorough sweep. In the bedroom, not far from Marty's body, they found several bullet casings. They also found a key to Marty's gun safe on the floor, and they located the safe in the closet. So Wilson's first thought was that someone who knew that Marty kept guns in his safe had taken the key, gotten a weapon out of the safe, and then using that weapon, they had killed Marty and attempted to kill Glenna. And the idea that the killer was someone the couple knew made sense because there was no sign of forced entry in the house. Now, Marty and Glenna's neighbor had found the front door unlocked, so it was possible that maybe Marty or Glenna had unknowingly welcomed the killer into their home. But the forensics team also found something very strange in the bedroom. Marty had died while clutching a patch of hair in his right hand, so they would need to run DNA tests to see if the hair matched Marty's or if it belonged to someone else, like maybe his killer. Sergeant Wilson heard someone calling to him from the living room, so he stepped out of the bedroom and headed that way. When he got there, he saw a forensics officer on the ground bagging a piece of evidence. The officer had found a .22 caliber Ruger revolver underneath one of the living room chairs. Sergeant Wilson knew they would have to wait for ballistics testing to see if this revolver really was the murder weapon, but Wilson already had a strong feeling that very likely this was the murder weapon. And he was almost positive that that gun must have come out of Marty's safe. After several hours in the house, Wilson felt like he still had a lot of questions to answer, so he called the hospital in hopes that Glenna was now in stable condition and able to talk to him about who had shot her and her husband. But doctors would tell him that Glenna unfortunately was still very much recovering from her wound and not really in a good position to talk to him, at least not yet. So Sergeant Wilson decided if he couldn't talk to Marty's wife, then he would just start his investigation with other members of Marty's family, his kids. On May 14th, so a day after Marty's body had been discovered, Marty's two sons and his daughter climbed under the crime scene tape outside of Marty's house and approached the front door. They all stood at the door, still in total shock. How could this place that had made them so happy over the years now be just a violent crime scene? It just didn't make sense to them. The siblings entered the house. They were there to pick up Bud the parrot so they could bring him back to their mother, Marty's ex-wife, Christina. But before they actually made it to the bedroom to grab Bud, they were all stunned by the mess in the living room. Their dad and their stepmother had always kept the house very neat and tidy, so it didn't even look like the same place. Then something caught their attention. A large manila envelope was on the living room floor amongst the mess, and so one of Marty's sons crouched down and opened the envelope and looked inside. And he showed the contents to his brother and sister, and they all agreed this was something they should hold on to. Then they went to the bedroom to get Bud the parrot. Soon after they had left, the siblings brought Bud to their mother's house. Then they decided to show the police the manila envelope they had found. Later that day, after Marty's children had contacted the police, they were brought into the local station to be interviewed. Sergeant Wilson had already planned to begin his investigation with Marty's kids, but now that they had this manila envelope, he was so eager to speak with them. Wilson knew there was a good chance that he was simply dealing with three grief-stricken young people who had just lost their father, but he still could not eliminate any of Marty's kids as potential suspects, at least not yet. So Wilson first led Marty's oldest son, Justin, into a small office at the station. Wilson wanted to meet with each of Marty's kids separately. He believed that if one of the kids had information about the case, they were more likely to share it if each of them was on their own. In the office, Wilson told Justin they were not accusing him of anything. They just wanted to talk to him to see if he had any information that could help with their investigation. And Justin was very calm and seemed eager to cooperate. Wilson asked Justin if he knew about any enemies his father might have, or if his dad had recently had a falling out with any of his friends. Justin said he couldn't think of anyone. He said his dad was really close with his neighbors and his hunting buddies, and they all seemed to get along really well. But then, Justin got a look on his face like he just remembered something. He looked up at Wilson and told him that there were a bunch of people who knew his father had a big supply of prescription pain medication inside of his house. When Wilson heard this, he immediately sat back in his chair and just thought for a second. At the time, the opioid epidemic in the United States was near its height. Prescription painkillers, like the ones Marty took, were in very high demand, and addicts had been known to commit terrible crimes to get a hold of these drugs. So Sergeant Wilson started to wonder if someone who knew Marty had killed him and attempted to kill his wife simply to get a hold of Marty's pills. After they talked a bit longer, Wilson thanked Justin for his cooperation and told him police would be in touch if they needed anything else. Later that day, Wilson and other investigators met with Marty's 2 other kids, and their version of events surrounding their visit to their dad and stepmother's house and the manila envelope they found in the living room were all basically the same. So, in the following days, investigators met with other people who were close to Marty to see if they had any information they might be able to add. And one of the people investigators spoke to said she knew that Marty's guns were not the only things that he and Glenna kept locked up in their safe. They also kept a couple of $1,000s in cash locked up. But, as Sergeant Wilson knew, no cash had been found inside of that safe. And so suddenly, the information about this missing money and the information Marty's son had given about Marty's pills started to paint a picture of what happened for investigators. And so now their theory was that someone Marty and Glenna knew had possibly come to their house with the intention of robbing them of their cash and their prescription drugs. So Wilson wanted to meet with anyone who had known about the safe in the couple's house to see if he could track down the missing money and Marty and Glenna's attacker. It had only been about a week since the attack, but Sergeant Wilson and the rest of his team were already getting frustrated. They felt like they had all these puzzle pieces right in front of them, but none of the pieces seemed to connect. There was the missing money from the safe, there was that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found in the living room, and there was the potential that somebody had wanted to steal Marty's prescription pain pills. But as investigators spoke to just about anybody who had any connection to Marty and Glenna, they couldn't find any evidence that sort of pointed to a particular person, a primary suspect, and they still had no leads on the missing money. Wilson had desperately hoped that Glenna would be able to provide the missing pieces that would make the puzzle kind of come together, but she was still recovering in the hospital, and so for now, an interview was still not possible. But when the investigation began to look like it was genuinely running into a dead end and might go cold, Michigan State Trooper Barry Wolf took a phone call at his desk. Wolf, like other members of the investigative team, had been worried about the lack of progress they were making. But as he listened to this caller on the other line, he wasn't sure if he was getting the tip police had been hoping for, or if he was about to be sent on an insane wild goose chase. The caller was a woman who was named Fran Fallon. She was the wife of one of Marty's cousins, and she was a self-proclaimed psychic. On the phone, Fran told Officer Wolf that she had received important information about Marty's murder during a psychic reading, and she'd like to share this information with the police. And so Wolf told Fran he'd be right over to see her. Then, Officer Wolf told Sergeant Wilson about this call, and neither of the men really believed in psychic phenomena. But a person saying they had potentially important information about this case, especially someone who had a family connection to the victim, couldn't be ignored. So after speaking to Wilson, Wolf left the building, got into his cruiser, and went to meet Fran at her house to see what her supposed visions had shown her. When Wolf arrived, he found Fran sitting on her back porch, and she motioned for him to join her. Wolf introduced himself, thanked Fran for contacting him, and then took a seat next to her. Fran spoke in a low but very confident voice. She knew some people thought she was crazy or just making things up, but she trusted her psychic gifts, and she felt like the police should trust them too. Fran reached down beside her and took a small notebook out of a folder. She told Wolf that she had written down information she'd received during a recent psychic vision. Then she flipped open the notebook and began reading. Fran told Wolf that it was important for police to look under the couch or the love seat in Marty and Glenna's living room. Then Fran looked up and stared directly into Wolf's eyes and told him that Marty's right hand was also going to be very important to the investigation. When she said this, Wolf sat back in his chair and just stared at Fran in disbelief. Investigators had found that Ruger underneath a chair in the living room. Sure, that wasn't the same as a couch or a love seat, but that was pretty close. Also, Wolf was shocked to hear Fran mention Marty's right hand because Marty had been found clutching that patch of hair in his right hand. But Wolf's first thought was not that this woman was actually psychic. It was instead that she clearly had information about a crime scene that only somebody who had been there would know about. And so Wolf did not want to alarm Fran in any way that he could be onto her, and so instead he just smiled and told her that this was very interesting, and then he asked her where she had been at the time Marty was murdered. And Fran would tell him that she had been with her daughter. After that, Wolf thanked Fran again for getting in touch with him, and then he walked off her porch and went back to his car. Once he was inside and turned it back on, he gunned the engine and sped back to the station to tell the rest of the investigative team about this weird meeting. And once he did tell them about this weird meeting, the Michigan State Police had to either accept that Fran really got this information from a psychic reading she'd done, or they would have to add a local psychic to their list of suspects. Sergeant Wilson told investigators to follow up on Fran's alibi, and he could barely believe the turn this investigation was taking. But it wouldn't be long before Wilson realized having a psychic involved was not remotely the weirdest thing about this case. In October of 2015, so almost 5 months after the attack that left Marty dead, Sergeant Wilson finally got the call he'd been waiting for. Glenna had been released from the hospital, and she was now able to speak with police. Investigators had spent the last few months searching for that lost money and looking into the psychic's background, and they had come up empty. They had potential suspects, but none of them seemed all that viable. But now, Wilson would be able to talk to someone who was literally there when the attack happened, Glenna, and he hoped she'd be able to clear up a lot of the questions that he and his team still had. Glenna met with Wilson at the police station, and after they made it into the interview room, Wilson asked her, what do you remember about the day that you and your husband were attacked? And immediately, when Glenna began to talk, Wilson knew he was not going to get the clear-cut evidence he had been hoping for. Glenna told him she'd been struggling with her memory ever since she arrived at the hospital. She said she could barely remember anything about the day of the shooting, or even the days leading up to it. Wilson knew Glenna was dealing with a serious head injury, so her memory loss did not come as much of a surprise. But he still believed Glenna was going to be the key to figuring out who killed Marty. So Wilson began talking to Glenna about pieces of evidence that had been found at the scene, hoping maybe something would spark her memory. But by the end of the interview, Glenna had not remembered anything that could point the investigation in any one direction, and so Wilson began to feel lost again. So, as the weeks and months passed, investigators continued to pursue all of their potential leads, but they still had no clear killer, and Marty's family was now also starting to become very frustrated. They wanted answers, and they wanted some kind of closure. But even as the 1-year anniversary of Marty's murder approached, the case was still open, and people close to Marty had no idea if it would ever be closed. In May of 2016, so a year after Marty was killed, a news reporter for a Grand Rapids, Michigan TV station stared at a video playing on his computer screen. His eyes were wide and his mouth was hanging open. This guy couldn't believe what he was watching. On the video, Marty's pet parrot, Bud, was clinging to the side of his cage, and he was shouting in Marty's voice. Then the parrot's voice would completely change, and he would speak in somebody else's voice who was not shouting, and then the parrot would shift back into Marty's voice, and he would keep on shouting. The reporter was watching Bud mimic an argument the bird clearly had heard between Marty and somebody else, and the reporter was almost certain the other voice that Bud was mimicking belonged to Marty's killer, and that this argument must have taken place right before the murder. Because at one point in the video, Bud mimicked Marty's voice by yelling, "Don't fucking shoot!" The reporter watched the entire video, and then when it was done, he watched it again. And afterwards, he knew it had to be aired. The news station contacted Marty's first wife, Christina, who had gotten Bud back after Marty was killed. Christina told producers at the station that she was the one who had shot that video about a month after Marty's murder, but she had only told people who were close to her about it. She had never intended for it to make the news. But around the year anniversary of Marty's death, Marty's parents had done a follow-up interview with a local TV station, and during that interview, the video of Bud the Parrot screaming "Don't fucking shoot" had come up, and eventually that video of Bud was shown to the local news crew. And then somehow, the video made its way to the much larger TV station in Grand Rapids. And not long after that, the Grand Rapids TV station played Bud's video on the news, and soon the story got picked up all over the world. Suddenly, Bud the Parrot seemed like a hero. He was like a key witness to an unsolved murder, and everyone believed he was going to be the key to solving the case. The worldwide attention Bud's video brought to Marty's murder might have put added pressure on the investigative team, but police insisted that the Parrot video did not change the way they were pursuing the case. Then, in June, a month after Bud's video appeared on TV, investigators announced they had actually made an arrest in Marty's murder case. Police maintained that Bud the Parrot's supposed eyewitness account of the murder had nothing to do with the arrest. It just so happened that at this time, they had finally figured out who took the money from Marty's safe, and soon after that, they had discovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led them to Marty's killer. Based on evidence found at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of May 12, 2015, when someone killed Marty Durham in his bedroom. At 5 a.m. on May 12, 2015, the glow from the killer's phone lit their face as they walked down the hallway inside of Marty and Glenna's house. The killer was breathing heavily, and they were scared and nervous, but they managed to walk quietly towards the bedroom. Once they got there, the killer opened the bedroom door and stepped inside. The low light from the killer's phone provided enough illumination that the killer could see the African gray parrot in its cage. The killer quickly walked across the room to the closet, then they opened it up and used their phone light to locate the key to the large gun safe that was inside. Once they had the key, the killer held their breath and unlocked the safe. Tucked away amongst several hunting rifles, they found a loaded .22 caliber Ruger revolver. The killer grabbed the gun and stared at it in their hand for a second. Then they turned, stepped out of the closet, approached the bed, and just started yelling. And immediately, Marty, who was in bed, he sat up, totally startled, and the noise caused Bud the Parrot to start squawking, which only added to the confusion. Marty kind of shook himself awake, and he saw the killer just standing there, and still not sure what was happening, Marty just began screaming too, so Marty, the parrot, and the killer are all yelling. But then, in the light from the killer's phone, and the glow from the moon that was coming in through the window, Marty noticed the killer had a gun by their side. And so Marty pulled himself up and out of bed, and right away he very likely felt that pain shooting through his legs and back, and at the same time Bud keeps squawking from his cage, and the killer kept shouting at Marty. I mean, it was absolutely chaos, but Marty was still hopeful he could maybe get out of there. And so Marty raised up his hands in a defensive position and tried to walk past the killer. The killer raised the gun and aimed it right at Marty's chest, and Marty screamed, "Don't fucking shoot!" But the killer fired. They fired 3 shots in rapid succession, hitting Marty in the chest again and again and again. Then the killer fired 2 more times, and those bullets struck Marty's forearm and his back as he fell. Marty collapsed on the floor, dead. And the killer just stood there, staring down at Marty's body. Then the killer took a deep breath, calmly walked out of the bedroom, and made their way towards the front door, and they unlocked it. Then the killer made their way to the living room, and they tipped a lamp off an end table onto the floor. Then they emptied a desk drawer and some shelves and made a total mess of the place. Then the killer just kind of stood there, scanning around their house, looking at what they had just done. So far, their plan had gone exactly the way they hoped, but the hardest part was yet to come. Finally, the killer took several deep breaths, doing their best to stay calm and steady. Then they raised their gun and placed the barrel behind their right ear, and they pulled the trigger. Immediately, blood began pouring out of the wound, and the room began to spin, but the killer kept their balance long enough to toss the gun under a nearby living room chair. Then the killer stumbled back into the bedroom and fell down onto the ground, and before they passed out, they grabbed a huge pile of blankets nearby and pulled them up and over their head. It would turn out Glenna had murdered Marty, and then obviously shot herself in the head. It turned out that Marty and Glenna's marriage had not been as perfect as some of their friends believed. Over the years, Glenna had racked up a huge amount of debt. She had lost about $75,000 gambling at nearby casinos, and as a result, she had stopped making mortgage payments on their house. But Marty never knew any of that. Not long before the murder, Glenna had learned that the house that Marty loved so much was now going into foreclosure, and so soon he would learn the truth and they would both be forced out. Early on in the investigation, police had actually learned about the pending foreclosure, and they discovered Glenna's gambling habit. So they started to think that Glenna had killed Marty and then tried to kill herself, seeing a murder-suicide as her only way out. And this murder-suicide theory was only bolstered when police looked inside of that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found when they went to Marty's house to get Bud. The manila envelope contained several letters that Glenna had written to her kids and to her ex-husband. In the letters, Glenna expressed how sorry she was and asked them to please take care of each other. Police believed those letters sounded like suicide notes. But in a case involving a psychic and a talking bird, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Because if it was a murder-suicide, why had thousands of dollars been taken from the safe? Why was the house completely wrecked? And why had the gun been hidden in the living room when Marty and Glenna were found in their bedroom? Those were questions investigators had to answer if they were ever going to determine what had really happened. Finally, investigators discovered who had taken the money from the safe because Marty's kids had come forward and admitted they took the cash when they went to collect Bud the parrot. Even though Marty's kids had taken the money, police still didn't consider them primary suspects. Instead, they thought Marty's kids were just young and foolish and had made a very bad decision. So, with the money from the safe now accounted for, investigators were able to rule it out as a motive for the murder. And the psychic's alibi eventually checked out, so the investigators crossed her off of their suspect list, but they would be left wondering how she seemed to know undisclosed details about the crime scene. DNA tests conducted on the hair found inside of Marty's hand also did not end up helping investigators. So all of this brought Sergeant Wilson and his team back to the possibility of a murder and failed suicide attempt committed by Glenna. But of course, there were still unanswered questions. It wasn't like they had found the gun in Glenna's hand. Then, in early summer of 2016, the media and the public latched onto that viral video of Bud the parrot saying, "Don't fucking shoot," and many claimed the other voice that Bud was speaking in sounded an awful lot like Glenna. But police continued to rely on more common investigative techniques to determine if Glenna was, in fact, the killer. They dug deep into Glenna's phone records and internet history, and when they had a clear picture of Glenna's online activity, they got the break in the case they had been looking for. It turned out that hours before Marty's murder, Glenna had been online researching various aspects of the .22 caliber Ruger revolver, the type of gun used to kill Marty. And some investigators believed Glenna had learned a lot more than just how to fire or reload the weapon. They thought she had found a way to shoot herself that would allow her to live and enable her to keep functioning even after she had pulled the trigger. In fact, a neurosurgeon would testify in court that the wounds found behind Glenna's ear were non-lethal, and that those wounds would not necessarily result in a loss of consciousness. This meant that Glenna could have shot herself in the head in the living room and then still managed to hide the gun, get back to the bedroom, and get into position under the blankets, all before she was found. So, as bizarre as this case had seemed at times, investigators believed they had solved the most important part of the puzzle, that Glenna had murdered Marty. Some people close to the case would continue to believe that the crime was still the result of Glenna's failed murder-suicide plan, meaning Glenna really did intend to end her life, but just didn't, because where she shot herself was non-lethal, even though Glenna denied the letters she had written to her family were suicide notes. Others believed there were even darker motives at play, and that Glenna murdered Marty, then tried to make it look like a robbery, and then also tried to make herself look like a victim too, so they didn't believe suicide was ever part of Glenna's plan, that she definitely did try to intentionally shoot the part of her head that wouldn't kill her. This was all a big con. But it's not clear what Glenna's motives were for doing this. Like, what did she stand to gain by killing her husband and framing this whole thing? It just didn't make any sense. But regardless of what the actual reason was for why Glenna did what she did, by the summer of 2016, police had enough evidence to arrest her. Glenna was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2019, Bud the parrot was living with Marty's first wife, Christina, and a fellow African gray parrot named Ozzy. Christina said the two birds have become best friends. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his 3rd deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Kurt, along with 7 people under his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Kurt called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Kurt. But ultimately, they got it done, and Kurt cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Kurt undid the 3 dogs on his hatch and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Kurt crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch, he undid the 3 dogs, he opened up the hatch, and then using a remote-controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Kurt could inspect them through the scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Kurt just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Kurt was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Kurt, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Kurt's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Kurt. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Kurt. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower 2 dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the 2 lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Kurt could have gotten inside of the scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside, and so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up the scavenger air recovery hatches, and it wasn't the sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Kurt. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower 2 dogs and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Kurt's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman completely independently had gone around to the back of the scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it. And he unlocked the 3 dogs, he opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all 3 dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the scavenger air unit. And he said, hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Kurt wasn't in there. And you just checked, right? He's not in there. And the foreman said, yeah, no one's in there. It's all good. And so the 2 of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag. They just left. The search for Kurt continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority and he said, hey, we're down someone. Can you please send someone out to look around? And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Kurt. And so finally 9:30 came around, and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave, even though they had no idea where Kurt was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Kurt must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier, when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame, because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me, and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second-guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone. Even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found, and so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch, and he heard the sound of them locking all three dogs. At this point, you gotta figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is gonna become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's gonna happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat up until Kurt was cooked alive.
Our next story is called Wrong Door.
On August 14th, 2012, Celestino Cervantes picked up 28-year-old Victor Diaz for work. Celestino was an expert roofer, and he had just hired Victor to come on his crew and help him with a particular job. This was going to be Victor's first day as a roofer, but for the past 10 years he had worked in construction, so he was familiar with the operation. The two men arrived at their job site in San Antonio, Texas around 8 a.m. that morning. They were in charge of putting a new roof on a 115-year-old building that was being redeveloped into a fancy steakhouse. Until 2001, this building had been used by a brewing company to house their enormous boilers. As such, this building was referred to as the Boiler House. Protruding from the boiler house roof was this large metal duct that was 15 feet long and almost looked like a covered walkway, and it connected to the side of this huge smokestack. This duct and smokestack used to be how the built-up condensation inside the boiler house was able to travel up and out of the building. When the two roofers got out of their truck, Celestino told Victor to take his tools and make his way up to the roof of the boiler house and get to work, and that he had a few things he had to do down on the ground floor, but he would be up to check on him in a little bit. Celestino turned around and was fiddling with his equipment inside of the truck, while Victor made his way into the building and out of sight. An hour and a half later, Celestino went up to the roof to check on Victor, but he couldn't find Victor anywhere, and he couldn't find his tools anywhere. So Celestino went back down into the main section of this building where other contractors that were working on this renovation were, and he began asking them, hey, have you seen this guy, Victor? He works with me, I can't find him, and no one had seen him. And so Celestino's thinking to himself, well, I guess Victor must have left, but that didn't really make any sense because Victor didn't have a vehicle and he didn't live nearby. But Celestino's thinking, you know what, maybe somebody came and picked him up. Now, unfortunately, Victor did not carry a cell phone, so nobody had any way of getting directly in contact with him. So Celestino leaves the building and he calls Victor's brother and he asks him, have you seen Victor? Do you know where he might have gone? And Victor's brother says, no, I haven't seen him since this morning when he left with you. So Victor's brother began calling around to friends and family and asked them if they had seen Victor, but nobody knew where he was. So for the rest of the day, Celestino and the rest of Victor's friends and family, they went out looking for Victor at the job site and around the surrounding areas, but there was just no sign of him. And so that night, Victor's brother went to the police to file a missing person report. But the police told him that it was really too early to file a report because Victor was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, and that he should just come back in a day or two if Victor still has not shown up. 2 days go by and Victor had still not shown up, so Victor's sister-in-law went back to the police and says, okay, now I want to file a missing person report. We don't know where he is, no one can get in touch with him, we need your help. But the officer she spoke to told her that she still needed to wait another 5 days to process this request. It would turn out this was just not true, it was a mistake. There was no arbitrary waiting period to file a missing person report. So without any help from the police, Victor's friends and family and coworkers spent the next several days scouring San Antonio, scouring the job site, looking everywhere for him and handing out flyers and asking people if they'd seen him, but no one had. He had just disappeared. By Monday the following week, so 6 days after Victor has gone missing, his family had printed out dozens of these huge posters with his face on them and a number to call if you had any information about him, and their plan was to distribute them the following morning all over San Antonio. But the following morning, before they headed out, they got a call. Victor had been found. 7 days earlier, when Celestino told Victor to head inside and make his way to the roof and begin the project, Victor had gotten his tools, gone inside, he made his way up the stairwell to the second floor, and then he made a series of odd decisions. Instead of making his way to the access door and climbing his way up to the roof, he went to the far side of the second floor where there were all these wooden barriers preventing people from going any farther. He climbed over all these barriers and he reached the entrance to that huge duct where the condensation used to go. And so from his perspective, he would have been looking into this duct and it would have been completely pitch black because it connected to that smokestack and the smokestack was totally sealed off. But despite not having any idea where this tunnel goes, and it clearly not being the place Celestino told him to go, Victor decides to just get into this tunnel, which required bending over because it was only 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide. So he gets inside of this tunnel and he begins shuffling his way deeper and deeper into this tunnel until he reaches the end of the tunnel where it actually connects into the smokestack. Now, at the top of this duct, where it connects to the smokestack, there wasn't a grate or bars or any sort of barrier that would stop you from spilling into the smokestack. And because it was totally pitch black, Victor, when he made it to the edge of that duct, he just kept on walking and fell 20 feet down to the bottom of the smokestack. And so in total darkness, Victor, who was probably badly hurt from the fall, began feeling around the inside of the chimney looking for a way out. And he eventually found a hatch that was big enough for him to fit through. But when he felt up against it, he realized it was locked from the outside and it wouldn't even budge. He couldn't even get light to come in through a crack. It was totally sealed off. And that was the only way out of the smokestack unless he could get back up to the duct. But there was no way to do that. He most likely began screaming for help, but he was encased in thick brick, and so his sound wouldn't have traveled. It would have been completely muffled. Plus, the smokestack was fairly far away from the job site, which was very noisy as it is, and so there was just no way they could have heard him. And the smokestack and the duct were not part of the renovation, and so there was absolutely no foot traffic over around the smokestack. He was completely alone, no one knew he was there, and there was no way out. 7 days after Victor fell into the smokestack, workers over at the job site, they noticed this huge swarm of flies over around the base of the smokestack. There were so many flies over there, they decided they had to go investigate. And so as they walked closer and closer to the smokestack, they were hit with this overwhelming stench of death and decay. And then when they got to the smokestack, they could see the flies were centralized on that hatch at the bottom. And so they cut the lock, they opened it up, and inside they found Victor's body. And they saw his hands were badly bloodied and bruised, and they were pressed up against the inside of the hatch, indicating in his final moments he was desperately trying to open that hatch and save himself, but there was just no way to do that. Although no one knows this for sure, it's believed Victor confused the condensation duct with the access point to the roof.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Bones.
In 2017, an electrician named Pete had become accustomed to doing work in basements and sub-basements of older buildings in Baltimore, Maryland. He discovered that many times when he worked in a stretch of older buildings right next to each other, that in the basement or sub-basement, there would be a stretch of tunnel that connected each building to each other, kind of like a common door in a hotel room. One day, Pete was asked to install some new lights in the sub-basements of 3 very old buildings that were all right next to each other. Apparently, someone had purchased the entire building complex after they had sat there abandoned for some time. When Pete arrived, his foreman, whose name was Mike, was waiting for him outside the farthest east building. And so Pete got out, walked up to the building, and Mike led him down to the basement and then down another flight of stairs into the sub-basement. The first thing Pete did was pull his flashlight out and look around and see if there was a tunnel connecting to the adjoining buildings, because if there was, it would make his life a lot easier. And sure enough, he shined his light to the west and there was a tunnel. And so he knew he wouldn't need to lug his gear up and over after he was done with each building. After that, Pete and Mike set up floodlights inside of that first sub-basement they were going to be working in, and then they put their gear on and they got to work. After a few hours of Pete being really focused on what he was working on, he looked up and realized Mike was gone, and he assumed he must have gone upstairs for a lunch break. And Pete, who had had a really big breakfast, wasn't that hungry, but wanted to take a break, so he decided instead of eating, he would just go explore the other sub-basements. So Pete walked over to that first tunnel that went into the second building. He walked through it. It wasn't very far, maybe 5 or 6 feet to get into the next building. Once he got into that second building, it was totally dark because neither he nor Mike had actually gotten in there yet. And so Pete pulled his flashlight out and he scanned around the room, and he saw directly on the other side, still going west across the building complex, was yet another tunnel connected to the third and final building. And so Pete walked through the second sub-basement, shining around, looking for anything interesting. There was nothing down there. He got to that tunnel, he walked through, and he entered into the third and final room of the entire building complex. And so he lifted his flashlight up and he scanned around the room, and he was shocked when on the other side, still going west, as if there was a fourth building, there was another tunnel. Pete kept his flashlight trained on this tunnel, and he's thinking to himself, did I get something wrong here? Is there really 4 buildings? Because I'm almost positive there was 3. There shouldn't be a tunnel over there because there's no more buildings. And so he's really intrigued, and so he keeps his flashlight up and he starts walking across the room towards this tunnel, and he gets about halfway across this sub-basement when he hears someone's voice come out of this mysterious tunnel. And it sounds an awful lot like Mike's. And Pete would say that his initial reaction to this was, oh, I guess Mike must have had his lunch break and then come back down here and started doing the same thing I'm doing, exploring the other sub-basements. And so he's already checked out this tunnel and he wants to show me what's down there. So Pete walks over to this tunnel and he shines his light inside, and right away he can tell it's different than the other 2 tunnels he's walked through, because those went straight across, and this tunnel he's looking at goes down and kind of bends off to the right. And so totally unconcerned, because he believes Mike is down there already, he starts walking down this winding tunnel. After walking for a couple of minutes just straight down into this tunnel, he finally walks into this huge room with 20-foot high ceilings, and he lifts his flashlight up and he looks around and there's no Mike, and he yells out for him. He doesn't hear him, but he noticed in the middle of the room were all these small animal skeletons that had been arranged in a big triangle on the ground. And as he scanned across the ground with his light, he came to the right side of the room at one of the points of the triangle. And at the top of that point was this large dog-like skeleton lying on the ground. It looked as if the triangle was more like an arrow and it was pointed at this one large dog. Pete went back to looking around the room and he saw right across from him was another tunnel entrance into more unexplored passageway. And for a second he thought about just turning around and leaving because this whole thing was starting to give him the creeps. But then he heard what sounded like Mike's voice again calling from that unexplored tunnel. And so he decided, okay, I'll walk a little bit farther to see what Mike wants. And so Pete carefully walked across this room, being careful not to step on any of the bones. And right before he walked into this new tunnel, he pulled his phone out in case he might have service and he could just call Mike and see what he wanted. But he had no service on his phone, so he entered the new tunnel. Unlike the other tunnel that went down the whole time, this new tunnel was totally flat, but it was a little bit more narrow. And so as he's walking, it's kind of zigging and zagging, and it's just getting a little bit tight on his shoulders as he's moving. And after a couple of minutes of walking and yelling out for Mike and not hearing from him, he just stops and he just thinks, is this a good idea? Should I keep walking down this strange tunnel, or should I just go back and meet Mike back up in the sub-basement? And as he's standing there facing away from the direction he just came, he thinks he hears something behind him. So Pete turns around and shines his light, and there's no one there. He yells out for Mike, and Mike doesn't yell back. And then Pete hears the faint clicking sound of something moving on all fours in the chamber he had just come from. And he's thinking to himself, what could have gotten down here? There's only one way in, and I've taken the other tunnel. Did I miss some dog that was staying in the middle there? I think I would have seen an animal that was moving around. And so as he's thinking about this, he realizes the clicking sounds have stopped. It's gone completely silent. And so he stops, and he's just intently listening. And then all of a sudden, whatever it is out there starts running at full speed down the tunnel towards Pete. And so Pete immediately turns around and starts sprinting down this unexplored tunnel. All he hears behind him is this animal at full sprint, grunting and bouncing into walls as it gains on him. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, Pete gets to the end of this tunnel and he sees it's a small flight of stairs to a large metal door. He runs up and he grabs the door and he tries to open it, and it opens. He runs outside, pulls it shut, hears it click, and then he sinks down with his back against the door, pressing up against it to ensure it stays shut. And as Pete is sitting there, he hears this thing come barreling into the room where this door is, and it rams into the door, and he feels it shake the door forward, but the door holds. And then whatever it was just lost interest, turned around, and left. Even though this animal appeared to be gone and the door appeared to hold, Pete stayed sitting with his back up against the door for a couple of minutes while he composed himself. He really didn't know what to make of what just happened, because he's thinking to himself, that animal had to have been huge. It just nearly barreled this door down. I felt the whole door shake. I mean, if that's a dog, that is a huge dog. And also, where's Mike? Mike's the whole reason I went into this tunnel in the first place. He was calling to me, or so I thought he was, and I never saw him. And so Pete's totally confused and he's traumatized and he's looking around and he's finally taking stock of where he is. And he realizes he's under one of the docks of what would turn out to be the Four Seasons Hotel, which meant he was at least about a half-mile away from where he had started in the sub-basement of those buildings. Pete stood up and made his way up to the sidewalk where he called Mike. And Mike was very confused at what Pete was telling him because he said, I never went into that tunnel. I never went into the other sub-basements. At my lunch break, I just went upstairs and got a bite to eat, and when I came down, you were gone. And so Pete started talking about the animal he saw, and as he was describing it, he's thinking to himself how crazy he must sound, and he began to realize that it had to be, a stray dog got in there, and he just must not have seen it, and that was it. And so after they hang up, Pete is left thinking to himself, if that was a stray dog, then what were those bones arranged in that triangle for? And why did they seem to be an arrow pointing at that other bigger dog? And also, who was yelling to me inside of the tunnel if it wasn't Mike? But when Pete and Mike got back to those old buildings, they did not do any more exploration. It was like they were just not going to talk about what happened. Instead, they put a fold-up table in front of that tunnel that led down to the room filled with bones and whatever animal was down there, and they rushed the job in all the sub-basements, cut all the lights up as fast as they could. The last thing they did was they moved the table back out of the way and then ran up out of the building and never looked back.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer the Amazon Music follow button a scoop of their favorite ice cream, but slip an elephant laxative into it first. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. If you want to check out our merch, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on at Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com.